Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the La Bourdonnais variation of the French defense. So the French defense is when we have the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and wait, what the F? That's not a D, that's an F. What is going on here? Okay, so this is the La Bourdonnais variation, which is a sideline. But it has been played a few times, and on the surface it looks a bit scary, it looks a bit aggressive. But in reality it's nothing to be too afraid of. It often, like with a lot of these sidelines, it often just ends up turning into a bad advanced variation. But there is one important trick to know about. One cool little trick that black can do. The main thing to pay attention to is that white has not yet played the move pawn to d4. So that's important. That can be exploited later on. So in this position here, some players, like a very tiny amount of players, will play d3, but I think this is quite silly. I don't think this really makes any sense for white to do this. Like, I think it's generally like older players who just want to trade queens and go into an endgame. Like, here, all that black, needs to do to get a decent position is just take, and then after taking back, just trading the queens. Like, some players with white, they really desperately want to trade the queens, so they'll do this, but I don't think this is any good. In fact, if we turn on the engine's like, yeah, black is just slightly better here. And I just don't find this position very interesting. There are not that many games, but this is something that has been played. What's much more common is for whites to play pawn to e5. The other alternatives aren't really all that great either. Like knight f3 is kind of this silly gambit where black just takes and white plays knight g5, and here black can just play knight f6, hold on to the pawn that way, but engine actually quite likes pawn to f5, which looks a bit crazy, looks a little insane, but the engine really loves it. Like, I'll just turn that on really quick. So like pawn to f5 is like just about +2, whereas knight to f6 is still totally fine, it's just -0.5. And generally speaking, if a position is +2 for your side, then you're doing very well. In fact, the engine's kind of changing its mind now. It's like, oh, actually, this is -1.1. Like, black's just up a pawn. Where is white's compensation? And it's like, yeah, okay. Like, there aren't a whole lot of games that feature this, and honestly, it doesn't really look that challenging for black to deal with. Like, I personally would just recommend going for the knight f6 line here, because white's probably expecting you to play f5. White probably wants to surprise you and have some nasty traps. Whereas knight f6, black is at the very least going to be equalizing out of the opening. Like, it's going to take white a while to get this pawn back and all that kind of stuff. Like, black doesn't even need to hang on to this pawn, basically. Black can just develop and be fine. But anyway, and I guess one other move to mention, like over here, one other move that has been played is knight c3, but black can just take, and after white takes back, black can just develop, and if white now takes the knight, black can just take with the queen, and black is doing okay. Like, white has essentially just helped black develop. Like, this queen is out, but it isn't really anywhere where white can harass it. Normally, in the opening, you don't want to develop your queen because it will get attacked by your opponent. But in this case, it's actually very difficult for white to actually get at it. So developing the queen is not bad. And let's see. I guess the one final move before we get to the move that actually happened in the game. One final move is just e takes d5, but again, this isn't too interesting. This just kind of looks like a bad exchange variation where, what is this silly pawn doing here? I don't know. Like, basically nobody plays like this, and it's, it's almost like -1 for black. And Like, yeah, black can just develop. Where are the problems that white is posing for black here? So that is why the main move that we see here, the main move that white will play against you is pawn to e5, as nothing else really poses much in the way of problems for black. And this is kind of looking like an advanced variation, except instead of a pawn on d4, there is a pawn on f4. And that is an important detail to keep in mind. Alright, so generally black should just proceed as if it were an advanced variation, with the move pawn to c5, just striking at the center, fighting for control. White will often play knight to f3. This is very common here. You know, like maybe fighting for control of the d4 square, maybe preparing to play d4 at some point. Black can just continue by developing on their queen side with knight to c6. White will often continue with pawn to c3. Like, yeah, there aren't really any commonly played alternatives here, so pawn to c3. And now here is the part where black can deviate a bit, where black has something creative up their sleeve. So very often, like, black will want to put their queen on b6 and then put this knight on f5. However, there's something crafty that black can do given that white has not played pawn to d4. And black can do this in either order. Like, in the actual game, black played pawn to d4 right now. However, I personally prefer going knight ge7 first. And there are a couple of reasons why knight ge7 is better than knight h6. One reason is that since there is no pawn on d4, if white goes knight a3, which is what white generally does, white is generally going to be going to this square, there is no trick with pawn takes pawn, bishop takes knight, since there is no pawn on d4. But since there's no pawn on d4, now black can just go pawn to d4, and we're going to see the true reason why the knight goes to e7 and why the queen does not go to b6. So black is just threatening to get very annoying by playing pawn to d3, which would harass this knight if it went to c2. So white generally wants to prevent this. White generally does not want to allow that pawn to come to d3 and basically cramp this bishop by taking away these two squares for it to develop to. Like, if white plays pawn to g3 to try to get the bishop out that way, then all of these light squares would be very, very weak, although white's going to have to play pawn to g3 anyway, because in this position, black can play knight to d5, and now here's a good question. How is white going to defend this pawn? Like, that's a very good question. There's only really one good way to do it, or actually one possible way to do it, and that is by playing pawn to g3. And now here in this position in Grandmaster Anish Giri's course, he recommends that black play pawn to b6 with just the idea of putting this bishop on this long diagonal. Like, this is, you know, one of the nice things about this sideline, one of the nice things that black can exploit is that normally this bishop is a problem piece. Normally you have trouble finding a good place for it to go, but if you play these moves, if you play like this, then this bishop can find a nice future on this really nice long diagonal that white has just so generously provided us with. So Grandmaster Giri recommends playing pawn to b6 in his course, but that's not what happened in the game. Instead, what happened in the game was black played pawn to a6 with the idea of later playing pawn to b5 and then putting the bishop on this diagonal. So, before continuing with the game, I thought I should just introduce the players. So, with the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Alexander Stripunsky, and he is a Grandmaster from the United States, and let's see, he has won a number of prestigious tournaments in the US, including, let's see, I just need to look it up really quick. I want to make sure I get it right. 1 second, I have it in the notes of the comment at the beginning. The US Championship in 2004, and he also participated in the World Open in 2002. And with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Steven Zierk, who is also a Grandmaster from the US, but he is, I think, a fair amount younger than White, since he actually only became a Grandmaster in 2018, so actually after this game was played. And he is another American Grandmaster, and he won the under-18 section of the World Youth in 2010, and he became a Grandmaster in 2018, so my guess is that he was probably an IM when this game was played, since if I recall correctly, the World Youth is one of those tournaments where if you come in first, you get you get a title for free. Like, you don't need to get norms, you don't need to do any of that stuff. Like, there are a few tournaments out there that are kind of like that. Like, interzonal tournaments, for example, will often give you the IM title or the Grandmaster title automatically. I believe that Bobby Fischer is a player who basically became a Grandmaster that way. And yeah, he won the under-18 section of the World Youth in 2010, and he became a Grandmaster in 2018. And anyway, this particular game was played at the US Chess League in 2014, and more information about the players and the events can be found in the video description. Anyway, back to the game. So, in this position here, black has played pawn to a6 with the idea of just putting the pawn on b5, just developing and all that. And in this position, white now played the move knight to c2, which I think is a fairly, intuitive move. The engine wants white to instead fight for the long diagonal by playing bishop to e4, but I don't think that makes too much of a difference. We're not going to worry about being super accurate. Like, basically, if you can remember this far into this sideline, into this position, then you're already doing very well. Like, the rest of the game is just to see, how an opponent might play against this line. So anyway, white played knight c2. Black played pawn to b5. And now white decided to take. C takes d4. Black took back with the knight. I think black could also have taken back with the pawn, but I think black wanted to trade knights so that they could open up the c-file bits when they put their bishop on b7, so that's probably why they took with the knight. White took with this knight. Black took with the pawn. And now here, it's very important to see why white did not play knight takes pawn. If you want, you can pause the video and try to figure it out. Like, it's a pretty important reason. I will reveal the reason in 3, 2, 1. Just a very simple tactic. Black can just retreat this knight somewhere, probably here, and basically skewer these pieces. Like, there is no move that white can play that would defend the knight over here. The knight has to move out of the way, and then the queen can just take the bishop. White could try playing knight takes pawn, like just sacking one of the pieces for a pawn, but that's still not really all that great. But anyway, that's not what happened in the game. Instead, white played pawn to a3, and black plays bishop to c5. Not so much about defending the pawn. This is just a decent place for the bishop to be. Like, the bishop doesn't really have any other good squares. Like, e7 is the only real candidate, but there isn't really anywhere it can go to over here. And pawn to a3 has stopped it from going to b4. Like, this bishop is on the c-file, which isn't ideal, but black has a plan for dealing with that. And because white now plays pawn to b4, which is what white was preparing with pawn to a3, since black's bishop has already gone to c5, it can now just drop back to b6. It's getting out of the way of the rook. Whereas if white hadn't developed their bishop, then they would have to have developed to e7 in the future instead. And that's not so great. Anyway, white plays bishop to b2, attacking this pawn on d4, which is kind of one of those double-edged pawns. Like, on the one hand, it's taking some territory away from white, but on the other hand, it's a pawn that's difficult for black to actually defend. Like, it can't be defended with any of its neighboring pawns. So like this pawn over here is stopped from going and defending him. So is this pawn good? Is this pawn bad? I'm more inclined to say this pawn is good. I like this pawn. But there are positions where a pawn like that can be bad. So anyway, black just developed their bishop with bishop to b7. Just very nice squares for black's pieces. This bishop is a monster on this diagonal. Like, white should actually be trying to fight for control of this diagonal themselves. But anyway, white plays queen e2, possibly with the idea of playing bishop to e4, challenging this bishop on this beautiful diagonal. Black plays pawn to h6, reasonable move, since white might have ideas of going knight g4 and attacking, the h7 square, stuff like that. Or maybe knight g5 and then knight e4, things of that nature. So might as well just say no to that. Might as well make that harder for white to do. Like, black isn't currently in any super rush, like any big rush. Like, there's still tactics involving this pawn, so white can't really take it. Anyway, white plays rook c1, fighting for control of the c file. Black plays rook c8, also fighting for control. We have rook takes c8, queen takes c8. Black's queen is actually pretty active, potentially looking at this nasty square if this bishop ever moves away, or maybe going here if this bishop moves away, stuff like that. We have castle. White plays pawn to h4, trying to do something, trying to grab some space, maybe trying to attack on the king side. And here, black found a pretty cool move, pretty cool way to continue. It's not something that wins material, but it's just a cool little move. If you want, you can pause the video and try to find it. I'll reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. Move is knight to c3. I just really like this move. It's just a lot of fun. Like, basically, if white takes it, then this is just very nasty, since these bishops are just going to come alive. Like, black will have the two bishops, and black will be regaining the sacrificed knight. Right? And white's king is not going to be very comfortable over there. So I quite like that, but that is not what happened in the game. Like, white was smart enough to know better than to allow that. White's queen is under attack, so white just plays queen e1, getting the queen out of danger there. And here in this position, black made a bit of an inaccuracy that kind of potentially lost their advantage. Like, the best move according to the engine is actually a pretty intuitive move. It's one that's not that hard to find. It's just developing the black's final piece. Like, since basically he kind of renewing the defense of this knight, because even if white were to get their king to h2 or something, get their king off this diagonal, there would still be nasty double attacks involving this rook on this bishop and the pawn on this bishop over here. So that's part of the idea of rook d8. Another idea is just that very often the best move in a given position, like when there are no tactics on the board, very often the best move is to just improve your worst piece. And in this case, black's queen is actually fairly active. It does have a potential future. It is doing something useful. Whereas black's rook on f8, what is it doing there? It's out of the game. So that's why rook to d8 is an excellent move. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, in this position, black played the move queen to a8, which isn't too unreasonable. Like, this move's okay. It's just that the queen was already good on c8, and this rook is doing nothing. So it is better to just activate the rook. But anyway, this isn't too serious of a mistake or anything like that. It just kind of lost a bit of the momentum in a way. Anyway, white plays king g2 to defend this knight as it was under attack, and also to get the king off of this diagonal so that maybe white could play pawn takes knight, stuff like that. Black decides to go bishop to e4, trading their wonderful bishop for white's bishop over here. I personally don't like this trade. I personally really liked this light square bishop. I thought it had a great future ahead of it. But anyway, we have bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop. The knight is at least made a bit better by this trade, so at least black does have that going for them. We have pawn to d3, and then knight goes back to c3, and then white's bishop is like, I'm a pretty terrible bishop over here. I might as well trade myself for this knight. And then black takes back, at least improving their dark squared bishop in the process. We have queen takes c3, rook not rook d8, my mistake. Rook to c8. Black finally activates their rook, gets it into the game. White is currently up a pawn, but white's king is fairly exposed. And the extra pawn is kind of this guy, which is a bit of a weak pawn. It's a bit hard to defend. And in fact, it's not even a double-edged pawn, where it's far ahead and it's taking your opponent's territory. It's like, no, this is just a backward pawn. This is a pawn whose friends have run forward, run in front of him, and now he's stuck behind and he can't really come forward and all that. So he's probably going to get picked off. So anyway, white plays queen d2. Black plays queen d5. It's important to pay attention to this pin. Keep that pin in mind. So here, objectively, according to the engine, the game is just very even. Might just end in a draw. Like, I don't think this is dynamically equal. It's probably just equal. But white now played pawn to d4, which was inaccurate because this pawn is just going to fall. Like, perhaps white hallucinated something or miscalculated something. Like, this might have been a game in a faster time control. Anyway, we have rook to c4. And in this position, white made a blunder, rook to d1. And if you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out, why is this move a blunder? Why does this move lose the game? What's wrong with it? I will reveal the answer in 3, 2, 1. So the reason why this move is a blunder, why this move is losing, is because it doesn't really help defend the pawn. Like, basically, white can't take back with the queen here, at least not without losing material. And the reason why is because, remember this pin. This knight on f3 is not actually defending d4, whereas the bishop is defending this rook. So if white takes with the queen, black can take back with the bishop, and then white will have traded their queen for rook and bishop, which is very often not a good trade, and in this case, it's not a good trade, but it's really white's best option. Because otherwise, if white is like, okay, I lost the pawn, I'll just move my queen out of the way, the problem with that is that the rook on d1 will just be taken. Black will just take that rook and be up a rook. So in this position, white really only has one choice, which is to play queen takes rook. White cannot play knight takes rook because the knight is pinned. Anyway, black takes back with the bishop. White takes with the rook. Here, of course, if black takes the rook with their queen, white can just take back with the knight since the knight's not pinned anymore, and white would be very happy. White would just be up a knight in the endgame. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, we have queen versus rook and knight, and what's worse is that white's king is exposed. Like, very often in a situation of queen versus rook and knight, it usually favors the queen, but there are positions where the rook and knight can coordinate in such a way that they set up a fortress. Like, they set up a position where white, like basically the side with the rook and knight, can move one of their pieces just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and everything's defended, and the side with the queen can't make any progress, can't really attack anything or win anything because everything's defended. But that is not the case here. In this case, white's king is exposed, so the queen can potentially fork things, such as the king and this pawn. And so, this position, white plays king to f1. Like, white could have played king to h3, but that's not really that much better, since black can play queen f2, hitting both the rook and knight together. So white's best move would be rook d8 check, king h7, and then maybe knight h2, something like that. But then black could still play like queen to e3 like this. So this is another way the game could have continued if white had played king to h3 instead, but it doesn't really change much. Like basically the queen is going to be grabbing these pawns on the queen side, and black will just push a pawn to the finish line. But that's not what happened in the game. Instead, we have king to f1, and black just takes this pawn. On black's plan is just to make a queen on the queen side over here. White plays king e2. There isn't really much that white can do. Black plays queen b2 check. King goes back to f1 because what else? King f8. Rook d8 check. King e7, only move. Rook d6. Like, white's just trying to find something to do, as white can't really stop the inevitable. White tries coordinating their rook and knight to potentially stop these, pawns from coming up the board. We have a check, king g2. Black plays g6 because maybe white was trying to play pawn to f5 or something, so black might as well just try to crush all of white's hopes and dreams or anything, stuff of that nature. We have knight c6 check, king to f8. Another idea of pawn to g6 is to just make a place where the king can hide. We have rook to d8 check, king to g7, knight to e7, queen to c7, rook to g8 check, king to h7. White's pieces are in a bit of trouble here. They're both being attacked at the same time. Rook e8, and black plays pawn to b4, probably missing the tactic because this was probably a faster time control game, like maybe a blitz game, that kind of thing. Doesn't really matter. Black is super winning anyway. This move is by no means an inaccuracy. And black's like, oh, I guess I'll fork the queen and rook now. And it was in this position that white now resigned. So, just to recap really quick, the main thing to take away from this game is just that in this f4 line, it very often ends up looking kind of like an advanced variation. But there is this one little trick with the knight, right, to remember. Knight a3, d4, bishop d3, knight d5, and then just get this bishop onto this diagonal. Yep, that's the main thing to take away from this game. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you, and bye for now.